The massive crystalline chamber of the Galactic Council gleamed under the artificial suns that illuminated the floating city of Nexus Prime. Representatives from 47 different species sat in their designated sections, their varied forms creating a tapestry of evolution's endless creativity. The Zephyrians floated in their gas-filled bubbles, their tentacles writhing with nervous energy. The hulking Crothery delegates sat motionless, their rocky hides reflecting the chamber's light like living mountains. The ethereal Veiltar phased in and out of visibility, their presence marked only by the soft humming of their translation devices. At the center of it all stood John Morrison, a lone human in simple gray clothing, his hands bound with energy shackles that pulsed with an eerie blue light. He looked remarkably calm for someone facing execution by the most powerful governing body in known space. His dark eyes swept across the assembled representatives with neither fear nor defiance, just a quiet acceptance that made some of the more empathetic species shift uncomfortably in their seats. The Archon Zul'Thara, a being so ancient that entire civilizations had risen and fallen during its lifetime, rose from the central dais. Its form was difficult for most species to comprehend fully, appearing as a shifting mass of light and shadow wrapped around a vaguely humanoid skeleton of pure energy. When it spoke, its voice resonated through every translation device simultaneously, creating a haunting chorus that filled the chamber. Human designation John Morrison, the Archon intoned, its words carrying the weight of eons. You stand accused of the most heinous crime imaginable within our jurisdiction. The systematic extermination of an entire species. The Velkai genocide represents not merely mass murder, but the complete erasure of civilization that had existed for over 12,000 years. How do you answer these charges? John Morrison straightened his shoulders, but remained silent. His lawyer, a nervous Thelian whose scales kept changing color from green to yellow in obvious distress, started to speak, but John raised his bound hand slightly, stopping him. The gesture was small, but every being in the chamber noticed it. There was something unsettling about the human's composure. Your silence speaks volumes. Archon Zul'Thara continued. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Surveillance footage shows your ship, the Retribution, systematically bombarding Velkai colony worlds. 14 billion souls extinguished in the span of 6 months. Men, women, children, elderly, all reduced to ash by your weapons. The Velkai species, once numbering among the most peaceful in our galaxy, now exists only in historical records because of your actions. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of sounds as different species expressed their outrage in their various ways. The Crothery hammered their fists against their stone seats, creating thunderous booms. The Zephyrians' tentacles lashed violently against their containment bubbles. The crystalline Shardaki created a discordant symphony by vibrating their bodies at frequencies that made the very air shimmer. Through it all, John Morrison stood perfectly still. The Veltai representative, one of the few surviving members of their near-extinct species, rose from her seat with tears streaming down her pale blue face. She was small and delicate, with large eyes that reflected an ancient sadness. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper, but the chamber's acoustics carried it to every corner. He killed my children, she said, her words cutting through the chaos like a blade. My mate, my parents, my entire world. I watched from the escape pod as he reduced our cities to molten glass. I saw him kill billions of my people, and he shows no remorse. None at all. How can any being do this and feel nothing? The silence that followed was deafening. Even the most hardened warriors among the assembled representatives felt the weight of her words. John Morrison's expression never changed, but something flickered behind his eyes for just a moment. It was gone so quickly that most missed it, but the Veltai survivor saw it, and it made her step back in confusion rather than anger. Archon Zul'Thara gestured, and a holographic display materialized above the chamber. It showed star charts, battle reports, and surveillance footage of the Velkai worlds during their final days. The images were horrific even by galactic standards. Entire continents burned, oceans boiled away, and cities that had stood for millennia were reduced to radioactive craters in a matter of hours. The evidence is clear and indisputable, the Archon announced. Human Morrison acted alone, using advanced weaponry that violated 17 different galactic treaties. His ship's weapons were modifications of human military technology, enhanced with quantum destabilizers that made conventional shields useless. He hunted the Velkai with the methodical precision of a machine, showing no mercy to civilian populations. The human diplomat assigned to the case, Ambassador Sarah Chun, rose from the human section of the chamber. Her face was pale and drawn, and her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. The Earth government formally disavows any knowledge of Mr. Morrison's actions. He acted as a rogue agent, without sanction or support from any human authority. We stand ready to accept whatever punishment the Council deems appropriate, and we offer our deepest condolences to the Velkai people. Her words rang hollow in the vast chamber. Everyone knew that individual accountability was the foundation of galactic law, but the political implications were staggering. Humanity was still a relatively new member of the Galactic Council, having achieved spaceflight only 3 centuries earlier. They were regarded with a mixture of curiosity and wariness by the older civilizations, who had watched them expand aggressively through their local sector of space. The Crothery delegate, a massive being named Mordak whose voice sounded like grinding stone, stood up with obvious effort. The human species has shown aggressive tendencies since first contact. This atrocity was inevitable. Perhaps it is time to reconsider their membership in this council and take preventive action to protect other peaceful species from future human violence. Murmurs of agreement rippled through several sections of the chamber. The Zephyrians' tentacles waved in what their species considered a gesture of support. The logical axiom delegation began calculating probabilities on their internal computers, their mechanical voices creating a soft buzz as they shared data. Ambassador Chin shot to her feet again, her diplomatic training warring with obvious panic. Honorable delegates, I must protest this line of reasoning. One individual's crimes cannot be used to judge an entire species. Humans have contributed significantly to galactic peace and prosperity. Our research into quantum mechanics has advanced interstellar travel by decades. Our agricultural techniques have helped feed 12 different worlds. Our medical advances have saved countless lives across multiple species. The Shardaki delegate, a towering crystal being whose body refracted light into beautiful rainbows, chimed in with a sound like wind through crystal caves. Contributions cannot erase genocide. Human, your species' potential for violence has been demonstrated in the most horrific way possible. The question before us is not punishment alone, but prevention of future atrocities. Throughout this debate, John Morrison remained silent, but his eyes had begun to scan the chamber more systematically. He was studying the representatives, noting their positions, their security details, their apparent weapons, and defensive capabilities. Several of the more observant delegates noticed this behavior and shifted uncomfortably. There was something predatory about his assessment that made their instincts scream warnings. The Archon called for order as the debates grew more heated. Species that had been allies for centuries began arguing among themselves about the appropriate response to human aggression. Some called for immediate expulsion of all humans from Council space. Others suggested placing humanity under surveillance and restricting their technological development. A few extreme voices even suggested preemptive action to prevent future genocides. Enough! The Archon's voice boomed through the chamber, causing several of the smaller species to physically recoil. We are here to judge one individual, not an entire species. John Morrison, you have remained silent throughout these proceedings. Do you have anything to say before we pass sentence? For the first time since entering the chamber, John Morrison smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who knew something that everyone else did not, and that knowledge was about to change everything. He stepped forward as much as his restraints would allow and spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried easily through the chamber without any artificial amplification. Honorable Archon, esteemed delegates, I have indeed remained silent, because I wanted to hear what you all truly thought of humanity. Your words have been most illuminating. The chamber fell silent. There was something in his tone that made every survival instinct in the room activate simultaneously. Even the most ancient and powerful beings present felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. You speak of the Velkai genocide as though it were senseless violence. Morrison continued, his voice growing stronger. You mourn the loss of their peaceful civilization and condemn the brutality of their extinction. But you have all carefully avoided discussing one crucial detail about my actions. He paused, letting his words sink in. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. None of you have asked why I did it. The Velkai survivor gasped, her large eyes going even wider. Ambassador Chun had gone completely pale, and several delegates were beginning to look genuinely afraid. The Archon leaned forward, its form shifting more rapidly as what might have been curiosity or concern altered its energy patterns. Enlighten us, the Archon said carefully. Why did you commit this atrocity? John Morrison's smile grew wider, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on every being in the chamber. Because 3 months before I began my campaign against the Velkai worlds, I discovered what they had been doing to human colonies on the Rim worlds. What they had been doing for the past 50 years, ever since we first made contact with galactic civilization. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. The implications of his words were beginning to dawn on the more intelligent delegates, and the horror of realization was spreading through the chamber like a plague. You see, Morrison continued, his voice now carrying an edge that cut through the silence like a blade. The Velkai were very good at maintaining their peaceful reputation. They were masters of hiding their true nature from species they considered their equals or superiors. But humans? We were newcomers, primitives, fair game for experimentation. The holographic display above the chamber flickered and changed, now showing new images that made several delegates cry out in shock and revulsion. Human settlements reduced to ash, but not by warfare. These were surgical strikes, precise and methodical. Bodies laid out in geometric patterns. Children separated from their parents and arranged by age and size. The unmistakable signs of systematic experimentation and harvesting. 47 human colonies, Morrison said, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute fury held in perfect control. 2.5 million men, women, and children, all killed slowly, methodically, scientifically. The Velkai were studying us, you see, trying to understand human biology, human psychology, human limitations. They were particularly interested in our pain responses and our emotional bonds with our offspring. The images continued to flash above the chamber, each one more horrific than the last. Research facilities hidden on remote asteroids, filled with human test subjects in various states of experimentation. Detailed scientific notes in Velkai script describing optimal torture techniques for extracting information about human genetics and neurochemistry. Ambassador Chun had fallen back in her seat, her face a mask of shock and growing understanding. The other delegates were beginning to realize that their perception of the situation had been catastrophically wrong from the very beginning. I spent 2 years gathering evidence, Morrison continued, his voice never wavering. 2 years documenting every atrocity, every experiment, every murder. And then I presented it to this very council through proper diplomatic channels. He gestured toward the human delegation. Ambassador Chen received my report and forwarded it to the appropriate committees. The Velkai were contacted and asked to respond to the allegations. Do you know what happened next? The silence was deafening. Even the Archon seemed to have frozen in place. Nothing, Morrison said simply. Nothing happened at all. The Velkai denied everything, of course. They provided falsified documents and manufactured alibis. They pointed to their pristine reputation and their centuries of peaceful cooperation with the Council. And you all believed them without question because it was easier than confronting the possibility that one of your most trusted members was systematically murdering humans for scientific curiosity. The weight of his words settled over the chamber like a physical presence. Several delegates were beginning to look sick as the implications became clear. So I realized that justice would not come from this council, Morrison concluded. Justice would have to come from me. And it did. Every Velkai research facility was destroyed. Every scientist involved in the human experimentation program was eliminated. Every political leader who authorized or concealed the atrocities was hunted down and killed. I made sure that the Velkai species would never again have the opportunity to torture innocent beings for their twisted scientific curiosity. The revelation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The carefully constructed narrative of human brutality and Velkai victimhood had been completely inverted, and every being in the chamber was struggling to process the implications. The Velkai survivor, who had spoken so movingly about her loss, was staring at Morrison with a mixture of horror and something that might have been shame. Her people's reputation for peace and wisdom had been built on a foundation of hidden atrocities, and she was beginning to realize that she might not have known her own species as well as she thought. John Morrison looked around the chamber one final time, his expression calm once again. So now you have the complete truth, honored delegates. I am indeed guilty of genocide. I systematically exterminated an entire species because they were systematically exterminating mine, and because this council was too corrupt or too cowardly to stop them. He straightened his shoulders and faced the Archon directly. Pass your sentence. But remember that when you condemn me to death, you are setting a precedent that will echo through the galaxy for generations to come. You are announcing to every species under your protection that when faced with systematic extermination, they cannot count on the Galactic Council for justice. They will have to seek it themselves. The chamber erupted into chaos as the full implications of Morrison's revelation sank in. But this time the outrage was divided. Some delegates were horrified by the hidden Velkai atrocities and were beginning to question the justice of executing their exterminator. Others were terrified by the precedent that pardoning Morrison would set, fearing that other species might take justice into their own hands rather than trusting council procedures. And through it all, John Morrison stood calmly in the center of the storm he had created, waiting for the judgment that would determine not just his fate, but the future of galactic civilization itself. The truth was out now, and there would be no going back. The chaos in the chamber continued for 3 full hours. Archon Zulthara had called multiple recesses, but each time the delegates reconvened, the arguments grew more heated instead of reaching any resolution. The revelation of Velkai atrocities had fundamentally altered the moral landscape of the trial, but it had not simplified the legal questions at stake. During the 4th recess, emergency sessions were being held in dozens of smaller chambers throughout Nexus Prime. Species were consulting with their home governments, legal scholars were frantically researching precedents, and intelligence agencies were scrambling to verify Morrison's claims about Velkai activities. The initial forensic reports were already coming back, and they painted a picture even more horrifying than Morrison had described. Ambassador Chan sat in the human delegation's private chamber, staring at data streams that confirmed her worst fears. The quantum signatures from the destroyed Velkai research facilities matched Morrison's descriptions perfectly. Genetic material from hundreds of different human colonies had been found in the ruins, along with detailed experimental protocols that read like something from humanity's own darkest historical periods. How do we not know? She whispered to her aide, a young man named David Kumar, whose family had actually come from one of the colonies Morrison claimed had been destroyed. How could we have been so blind? Kumar's face was pale as he scrolled through reports that detailed the fates of settlements his cousins had lived in. The Velkai were very careful, ma'am. They only targeted rim colonies with minimal contact with the core worlds. They made the disappearances look like natural disasters, equipment failures, or attacks by space pirates. And they did it slowly over decades, so no pattern was obvious unless someone was specifically looking for it. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the human delegation's scientific advisor, looked up from her analysis tablet with haunted eyes. The experimentation protocols are incredibly sophisticated. They weren't just torturing people randomly. They were conducting systematic research into human neurochemistry, genetic structure, and psychological responses. This was a multi-generational scientific program designed to map every aspect of human biology and consciousness. The implications were staggering. The Velkai hadn't just been committing genocide for sadistic pleasure. They had been conducting the most comprehensive xenobiological research program in galactic history, using humans as unwilling test subjects. The knowledge they had gained would have given them unprecedented insight into human capabilities and weaknesses. Why humans specifically? Chen asked. What made us special enough to warrant this level of attention? Kumar pulled up another data stream, his expression grim. According to the recovered files, it was our rapid technological advancement. In the 3 centuries since achieving spaceflight, humans have advanced faster than any other species in recorded galactic history. The Velkai wanted to understand what made us different, what gave us such rapid adaptability. Dr. Vasquez nodded grimly, and the psychological experiments were focused on understanding human emotional bonds and social structures. They were particularly interested in our willingness to sacrifice ourselves for family members and our tendency to form pack loyalty with non-relatives. They called it irrational altruistic behavior and seemed to view it as both a strength and a potential weakness to exploit. The door chimed, and Security Chief Marcus Thompson entered with a concerned expression. Ma'am, we're getting reports from across the station. Several species are requesting emergency sessions with their home governments. The Axiom delegation has been running probability calculations for the past 2 hours, and their preliminary results are apparently causing significant concern among their leadership. Chen turned to face him. What kind of concern? The kind that results in defensive fleet movements, Thompson replied grimly. Long-range sensors are detecting unusual ship concentrations near several major species' home systems. Everyone's suddenly very interested in their defensive capabilities. The ambassador closed her eyes and rubbed her temples. Morrison's revelation was doing exactly what he had probably intended. It was forcing every species in the galaxy to confront some uncomfortable questions about the true nature of their neighbors and the effectiveness of council justice. If the Velkai could hide a 50-year genocide under the council's nose, what other horrors might be concealed behind facades of civilization and cooperation? Back in the main chamber, the debates had taken on an increasingly desperate tone. The Crothry delegation was pushing for Morrison's immediate execution, arguing that regardless of Velkai crimes, vigilante justice could not be tolerated. The Shardaki were calling for a complete investigation into all member species' activities, which had prompted several delegations to threaten withdrawal from the council altogether. The Zephyrian representative was floating in agitated circles within his containment bubble, his tentacles lashing with such violence that the containment field was fluctuating. The precedent this sets is catastrophic, he declared through his translation device. If we excuse Morrison's actions, we essentially announce that any species can exterminate another as long as they claim justification after the fact. But the mood was shifting. The ethereal communion, a collective consciousness species that rarely spoke in council sessions, had sent a representative who now hovered above their section like a glowing mist. When they spoke, their voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. We have consulted the greater consciousness, the ethereal said. Our collective mind has reviewed all available data regarding both the Velkai research programs and the human response. The mathematical probability that these atrocities could have continued undetected without some form of institutional complicity approaches statistical certainty. The chamber fell silent. The ethereal communion's analytical capabilities were legendary, and their pronouncements on complex matters were rarely questioned. Furthermore, the ethereal continued. Our analysis suggests that human Morrison's actions were not spontaneous vigilante justice, but rather a calculated response to a systemic failure of council oversight. The precision and completeness of his campaign indicate extensive planning and preparation. This was not revenge killing, but rather surgical removal of a persistent threat. The implications of this statement rippled through the chamber like shockwaves. If the ethereal communion was correct, then Morrison hadn't simply snapped and gone on a killing spree. He had methodically planned and executed a counter-genocide designed to eliminate a species that posed an ongoing threat to humanity. Archon Zultharaz's form was shifting more rapidly now, indicating deep consideration or possibly distress. As the eldest being in the chamber, it had seen the rise and fall of dozens of civilizations, and its perspective on galactic politics was unmatched. When it finally spoke, every being in the chamber listened intently. The evidence presented requires us to consider not just the immediate crimes, but the broader implications for galactic stability, the Archon said slowly. If we execute human Morrison for responding to systematic genocide that this council failed to prevent, we signal that species under threat cannot expect protection from us. If we excuse his actions, we signal that genocide is acceptable under certain circumstances. The Archon paused, its energy form flickering as it processed the implications. However, there's a third option that few have considered. The systematic nature of the Velkai research program suggests that this was not merely a crime against humanity, but rather a crime against the fundamental principles that govern civilized interaction between species. By this interpretation, human Morrison was not committing genocide, but rather executing a military action against an ongoing threat. Several delegates began to speak at once, but the Archon raised what might have been a hand, and the chamber fell silent again. The evidence shows that the Velkai research program was expanding, the Archon continued. Recent installations included facilities for experimenting on Thelian juveniles and Axiom computational cores. The Velkai were not content with studying humans alone. They were moving toward a comprehensive xenobiological research program that would have eventually threatened every species in this council. The Thelian delegate's scales immediately shifted to a deep red color indicating extreme distress, while several Axiom units began chattering rapidly in their mechanical language. The idea that they too had been targeted by Velkai researchers was clearly news to them, and deeply disturbing news at that. Morrison, who had remained silent during the extended debates, finally spoke again. His voice carried the same calm confidence it had before, but now there was an edge of satisfaction in it. "I see that your investigators have been busy," he said, looking directly at the Archon. Yes, the Velkai research program was expanding. Within 10 years, they would have had comprehensive biological and psychological profiles on every major species in Council space. Within 20 years, they would have possessed the knowledge necessary to engineer species-specific bioweapons, psychological manipulation techniques, and social control mechanisms. He gestured toward the assembled delegates, his energy shackles sparking slightly with the movement. "Every one of you would have been as vulnerable to them as my people were. The only difference is that you would never have known it was happening until it was far too late to resist." The Velkai survivor, who had been sitting in stunned silence since Morrison's initial revelation, finally found her voice. "You're lying," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "My people were peaceful. We were scholars, artists, philosophers. We would never dash. Your people were predators," Morrison interrupted, his voice cutting through her protests like a blade. "They were simply more sophisticated than most. Instead of hunting with claws and teeth, They hunted with laboratories and research protocols. Instead of killing for food, they killed for knowledge. But make no mistake, they were hunters, and the rest of us were their prey. Dr. Vasquez, who had been granted permission to address the chamber, stood up in the human section. If I may, honored delegates, our analysis of the Velkai research data has uncovered something that I believe is relevant to this discussion. The Archon gestured for her to continue. The Velkai weren't just studying other species for academic curiosity, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. They were developing something they called the Galactic Integration Protocol. Based on their notes, this appears to have been a plan to use their accumulated biological and psychological knowledge to gradually assume leadership positions within all major galactic civilizations. The silence that followed was even more profound than before. The implications of what Dr. Vasquez was suggesting were beyond horrifying. Not just genocide, but a plan for total galactic domination, disguised as peaceful cooperation. The protocol involved using species-specific psychological manipulation techniques to place Velkai agents in positions of influence, she continued. They had already identified key targets in 17 different governments, including 3 members of this very council. The chamber erupted into chaos again, but this time the anger was directed not at Morrison, but at the realization of how close the galaxy had come to falling under hidden Velkai control. Species that had considered themselves sophisticated and politically aware suddenly realized they might have been completely outmaneuvered by what they had assumed was a peaceful and harmless neighbor. The Archon called for order, but it took several minutes for the chaos to subside. When it finally did, the atmosphere in the chamber had changed fundamentally. The question was no longer whether Morrison should be executed for his crimes, but whether he should be honored for preventing a catastrophe that would have eventually consumed the entire galaxy. In light of these revelations, the Archon said slowly, this council must reconsider not only the charges against human Morrison, but our entire approach to interspecies oversight and security. It is clear that our current systems are inadequate to detect and prevent threats of this sophistication. Ambassador Chun stood up, her confidence returning as she realized the political winds were shifting. The Earth government formally requests that all charges against John Morrison be dropped, and that he be recognized as having acted in defense not just of humanity, but of all free species in council space. Seconded, came a rumbling voice from the Crothery delegation. Mordak had apparently changed his position entirely. The human acted when we failed to act. He saw the threat when we were blind to it. Honor demands that we acknowledge his service rather than punish his success. One by one, other delegations began to voice similar sentiments. The Shardaki chimed their agreement in harmonious tones. The Axiom units calculated the probability of galactic survival under Velkai domination and announced that Morrison's actions had improved their long-term survival chances by over 90%. Even the Ethereal Communion declared that the greater consciousness approved of Morrison's decisive action. But Morrison himself seemed unmoved by this sudden shift in his favor. He stood in the center of the chamber, still bound by energy shackles, watching the proceedings with the same calm detachment he had shown throughout the trial. "Your honors," he said, and the chamber fell silent again. "I appreciate this newfound support, but I want to be clear about something. I didn't commit genocide to save the galaxy. I didn't hunt down every Velkai to protect other species from future experimentation." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I did it because they hurt my people, and because this council failed to protect us when we asked for help. Everything else, all these noble justifications about preventing galactic catastrophe, those are just convenient rationalizations after the fact." The honesty of this statement was somehow more unsettling than his previous revelations. Morrison wasn't trying to be a hero or a savior. He was simply a man who had done what he felt was necessary to protect his own kind, and the fact that it happened to benefit everyone else was purely coincidental. "So before you vote to pardon me or honor me," Morrison continued, "understand what you're really doing. You're establishing the precedent that when the Council fails to protect a species from systematic extermination, that species has the right to take whatever action they deem necessary to eliminate the threat. That might seem reasonable now, but consider how it might be applied in the future. The chamber fell silent as delegates contemplated the long-term implications of Morrison's words. They were faced with an impossible choice. They could execute him and signal that species under threat could not expect justice from the Council. Or they could pardon him and signal that genocide was acceptable as long as it could be justified after the fact. Either choice would fundamentally alter the balance of power in galactic civilization, and the reverberations would be felt for generations to come. Archon Zultharaz's form was now shifting so rapidly that it was difficult to look at directly. The ancient being was clearly struggling with a decision that would define its legacy and potentially determine the future of interspecies cooperation. This council will recess for 24 hours, the Archon finally announced. All delegations will consult with their home governments and return tomorrow with their final positions. The decision we make here will echo through eternity, and it must not be made in haste. As the delegates filed out of the chamber in small groups, many of them arguing intensely among themselves, John Morrison remained standing in the center of the vast space. His guard approached to escort him back to his holding cell, but he didn't move immediately. He was looking up at the artificial suns that illuminated Nexus Prime, and for the first time since the trial began, his expression showed something other than calm detachment. It might have been satisfaction, or perhaps anticipation. The truth was finally out, and tomorrow would determine whether that truth would destroy the galactic order or transform it into something stronger. Either way, the universe would never be the same. The 24-hour recess had transformed Nexus Prime into a battlefield of diplomacy and intelligence gathering. Emergency communication arrays hummed constantly as delegations maintained contact with their home governments. Private meetings were held in shielded chambers. Secure channels crackled with encrypted data streams, and the station's usually serene atmosphere buzzed with tension that could be felt by even the most emotionally insensitive species. In the human delegation quarters, Ambassador Chun had barely slept. Reports were flooding in from across human space as the full scope of the Velkai atrocities became known. Colony worlds that had thought their missing settlements were victims of natural disasters or pirate attacks were discovering the horrific truth. Families that had mourned relatives lost in space accidents were learning that their loved ones had died as experimental subjects in alien research facilities. But the human response was not what most species would have expected. Instead of calls for revenge or demands for reparation from the Council that had failed them, there was something else spreading through human space. It was a cold, calculating assessment of their position in galactic civilization, and the conclusions were unsettling. "The preliminary reports from Earth are in," David Kumar said, his face pale as he read from his secure tablet. "The Colonial Authority has confirmed Morrison's claims about 47 missing settlements. The population count matches his figures almost exactly. 2.7 million human beings dead over 5 decades. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her own analysis. The psychological impact assessments are even more concerning. We're seeing a fundamental shift in how humans view our place in the galaxy. Trust in Council protection has collapsed completely, and there's a growing belief that we can only rely on ourselves for survival." Ambassador Chen rubbed her tired eyes. "What about the other human colonies? How are they responding to all this?" "That's the interesting part," Kumar replied. "Instead of panic or calls for withdrawal from galactic civilization, we're seeing massive increases in defense, spending, and military recruitment. Human worlds are implementing new security protocols and establishing independent intelligence networks. It's like the entire species has decided that we need to be prepared for the next threat, because the Council won't protect us from it." Dr. Vasquez nodded grimly. "The xenopsychology reports suggest this is a classic human adaptive response. When faced with evidence that the established power structure can't protect us, we don't retreat or submit. We build our own power structure. The implications were staggering. Humanity was essentially withdrawing from reliance on galactic institutions while remaining technically part of them. They were preparing to become a truly independent power in galactic affairs, with all the potential for conflict that implied. Meanwhile, in other delegation quarters across Nexus Prime, similar conversations were taking place with very different tones. The Velkai survivor, whose testimony had initially seemed so compelling, was meeting with representatives from several species that had been her people's closest allies. "I didn't know," she kept repeating, her voice breaking with each word. "My government told us that the research stations were studying mineral deposits and energy phenomena. I was a civilian education administrator. I never saw any of the military research facilities." The Shardaki delegate refracted light in patterns that indicated deep sympathy, but also caution. The evidence suggests that knowledge of the research program was restricted to a small group of Velkai leadership and scientific specialists. Your ignorance may be genuine, but it does not alter the fundamental reality of what your species was doing. She looked up with tears streaming down her face. "But what happens to me now? I'm one of only a few dozen Velkai left alive in the galaxy. Morrison killed everyone, innocent and guilty alike. How is that justice?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. It was the core moral dilemma that the Council would have to address. Did the systematic nature of Velkai atrocities justify the complete extermination of their species, including billions of individuals who had no knowledge of or participation in the research program? In the Crothry quarters, the massive stone-bodied delegates were having a very different discussion. War was something they understood instinctively, and they were viewing Morrison's actions through a military lens that made the moral complexities seem much clearer. The human acted like a proper warrior, Mordak rumbled to his fellow delegates. He identified an enemy that threatened his people. He gathered intelligence about that enemy's capabilities and intentions, and then he eliminated the threat completely and efficiently. This is how war should be fought. His second-in-command, a slightly smaller Crothry named Veltar, shifted his massive weight and considered this perspective. "But the scale troubles me, war leader. An entire species exterminated. Even in our most brutal conflicts, we have never pursued such complete destruction. Because we have never faced an enemy like the Velkai," Mordak replied. "They did not fight with honor. They did not declare their intentions or challenge their enemies to open combat. They struck from hiding, targeting the defenseless, using deception and false cooperation to mask their true nature. Such enemies cannot be defeated through conventional means." The Crothry military philosophy was based on direct confrontation and honorable combat. The idea of an enemy that operated through deception and hidden research programs was fundamentally alien to them, and therefore Morrison's response seemed not only justified, but necessary. Probability of galactic conflict within 50 years if Morrison is executed, 67.4%. Unit Prime announced to the collective. Probability of galactic conflict within 50 years if Morrison is pardoned unconditionally, 73.1%. The other Axiom units processed this data rapidly. The mathematics were clear but troubling. Either decision would significantly increase the likelihood of major interspecies warfare, but for different reasons. Explanation for increased conflict probability with execution scenario, requested Unit 7. Human species shows historically high correlation between perceived injustice and violent response, Unit Prime replied. Execution of Morrison, while acknowledging Velkai atrocities, would likely result in human withdrawal from Council cooperation and increased military preparation. Estimated time to open human rebellion against Council authority, 15 to 30 years. Explanation for increased conflict probability with pardon scenario, requested Unit 12. Pardoning genocide, even justified genocide, establishes precedent for species-level conflict resolution outside Council authority. Unit Prime responded. Estimated probability of copycat genocides by species with historical grievances, 41%. Estimated time to first copycat incident, 3 to 7 years. The Axiom Collective processed this grim assessment in silence. Their mechanical minds could see the logical pathways that led to galactic chaos regardless of the Council's decision. And they were struggling to find a third option that would minimize long-term conflict probability. In the ethereal communion's chamber, the collective consciousness was engaged in a form of deliberation that no individual species could fully understand. Thousands of interconnected minds were examining the Morrison case from every conceivable angle, sharing insights and perspectives across multiple dimensions of thought. When they finally reached a conclusion, it was not the one anyone would have expected. The floating mist that served as their representative in physical space began to pulse with different colors, indicating that an important communication was forthcoming. When they spoke, their words carried the weight of vast collective wisdom. The Morrison incident represents a fundamental failure of current galactic civilization structures, they announced. The question of individual guilt or innocence is secondary to the larger question of systemic reform. This perspective was radically different from the approaches taken by other delegations. Instead of focusing on punishment or precedent, the ethereal communion was viewing the entire situation as evidence that the current galactic order was inadequate to deal with modern threats. Our collective analysis suggests that Velkai-style hidden atrocities are not anomalous, but rather inevitable undercurrent oversight systems, they continued. Advanced civilizations will always be capable of concealing hostile activities from less sophisticated monitoring systems. The only effective response is a fundamental restructuring of interspecies relationships. As the recess period drew to a close, each delegation was finalizing their positions, but it was becoming clear that this would not be a simple vote on Morrison's fate. The revelations about Velkai activities had opened questions about the entire foundation of galactic civilization, and those questions would not be easily answered. When the Council reconvened, the atmosphere in the chamber was markedly different from the previous day. The shocked outrage had been replaced by grim determination, but there was also an undercurrent of uncertainty that had never been present before. The ancient institutions that had governed galactic civilization for millennia were about to face their greatest test. Archon Zulthara materialized at the center of the chamber, its energy form more stable than it had been the previous day, suggesting that the ancient being had reached some sort of internal resolution about the decisions to come. Honored delegates, the Archon began, we reconvene to address not only the immediate question of human Morrison's fate, but the larger questions raised by recent revelations. Each delegation will present their position, and then we will proceed to formal voting. The Crothry delegation spoke first, their position straightforward and uncompromising. Morrison acted as a warrior, defending his people from a hidden enemy, Mordak declared. His actions were justified, necessary, and effective. We vote for complete pardon and formal recognition of his service to galactic security. The Axiom Collective presented their analysis, their mechanical voices delivering probability calculations and logical assessments with perfect precision. Current data indicates that standard legal frameworks are inadequate to address the Morrison case, Unit Prime announced. We propose suspension of normal procedures and establishment of special tribunal to address systematic institutional failures that enabled Velkai atrocities. The Shardaki offered a different perspective, their crystalline voices creating harmonious tones that conveyed both sympathy and caution. We acknowledge the horror of Velkai crimes and the failure of council oversight, their delegate chimed. However, we cannot accept complete extermination as justified response. We propose partial pardon contingent on Morrison's cooperation with institutional reform efforts. One by one, each delegation presented their position, and a clear pattern began to emerge. Almost every species acknowledged that Morrison's actions have been justified by Velkai atrocities and council failures, but they were deeply divided on the broader implications of pardoning him completely. The most surprising position came from an unexpected source. The Velkai survivor, who had every reason to demand Morrison's execution, stood up in her section and requested permission to address the council. "I have spent the recess period reviewing evidence about my own species' activities," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional strain. "I have confirmed that the atrocities Morrison described were real, systematic, and far more extensive than even he initially claimed." The chamber fell silent. Her next words would carry enormous weight coming from the last representative of the extinct species. "As the final voice of the Velkai people, I formally acknowledge our crimes against humanity and other species. Morrison's actions were a justified response to systematic genocide disguised as scientific research. I do not call for his punishment." The impact of her statement was immediate and profound. If the primary victim was not demanding justice, what moral authority did the council have to impose it? But her next words were even more significant. "However," she continued, "I also call upon this council to ensure that such hidden atrocities can never occur again." Morrison's solution was effective, but brutal. The next species to face such threats should have better options than complete extermination of their enemies. Ambassador Chun rose to present humanity's formal position. "Earth acknowledges the Council's authority to judge human Morrison's actions," she said carefully. "However, we also announce that regardless of the verdict, humanity will no longer rely solely on Council protection for our species' survival. We are implementing independent defense and intelligence capabilities to ensure that we are never again vulnerable to hidden threats." This announcement sent shockwaves through the chamber. Humanity was essentially declaring independence from galactic security arrangements while technically remaining within the Council framework. It was a diplomatic middle finger wrapped in polite language. The voting began with a series of complex procedural questions about jurisdiction and precedent, but eventually reached the core issue: should John Morrison be executed for genocide? The first vote was closer than anyone had expected. 23 species voted for execution, 20 voted for pardon, and 4 abstained. Under normal council rules, this would have meant Morrison's execution, but the Archon invoked an ancient provision that required reconsideration when the vote was within 5 percentage points. During the second round of voting, something remarkable happened. 3 species that had voted for execution changed their positions after reviewing additional evidence about the scope of Velkai activities. The final tally was 26 for pardon, 17 for execution, and 4 abstentions. John Morrison was officially pardoned by the Galactic Council, but the victory felt hollow to everyone involved. The precedent had been set, but no one was quite sure what that precedent actually meant for the future of galactic civilization. Morrison himself seemed unsurprised by the outcome. When the Archon announced his pardon, he simply nodded and waited for his restraints to be removed. But his first words after being freed were not expressions of gratitude or relief. "Thank you for the pardon," he said, addressing the council as a whole. "But understand that this changes nothing fundamental about the situation. Other species will face similar threats in the future, and when they do, they will remember that the Council's protection cannot be counted upon." He gestured toward the human delegation. "Humanity has learned this lesson and is adapting accordingly. I suggest the rest of you do the same." With that, he walked out of the chamber, leaving behind a galaxy that would never again view interspecies cooperation with the same naive trust it had possessed just days before. The age of hidden atrocities was ending, but it was being replaced by something potentially even more dangerous: an age of mutual suspicion and independent action. The reverberations of the Council's decision were already beginning to spread across the galaxy at light speed, carried by quantum communication networks that connected thousands of worlds. And on every one of those worlds, leaders were asking themselves the same question: if the Velkai could hide systematic genocide for 50 years, what might their own neighbors be hiding? The answer to that question would reshape galactic civilization, one planet at a time. 6 months after John Morrison walked free from the Galactic Council chambers, The galaxy was already transforming in ways that no one could have predicted. The decision to pardon him had unleashed forces that were reshaping the fundamental nature of interspecies relationships, and the old order was crumbling faster than even the most pessimistic observers had anticipated. The first major consequence became apparent within weeks of the trial's conclusion. The Thelian Confederation, one of the oldest members of the Galactic Council, announced the discovery of hidden research facilities on 3 of their worlds. The facilities belonged to the Axiom Collective, and they had been conducting illegal experiments on Thelian neural architecture for over a century. Unlike the Velkai situation, this discovery was made not through investigative journalism or intelligence gathering, but through direct military action. Thelian special forces had raided the facilities simultaneously, capturing evidence and eliminating all Axiom units present. They had used Morrison's methods without hesitation or apology. The Axiom Collective's response was swift and devastating. Within hours of the raids, every Axiom manufactured device in Thelian space suffered simultaneous critical failures. Starships lost navigation, power grids collapsed, and communication networks went silent. Millions of Thelians died in the chaos that followed, and their civilization was effectively crippled. But the Thelians had been prepared for exactly this response. Their raids had been coordinated with human technical experts who had spent months developing alternatives to Axiom technology. Within days, human engineers were installing replacement systems throughout Thelian space, and the Confederation's infrastructure was back online with new security protocols that locked out all Axiom access. The message was clear. The Morrison precedent was being applied, and species were taking preemptive action against threats rather than waiting for Council intervention. The age of mutual trust was ending, and it was being replaced by an age of mutual surveillance and preemptive strikes. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed human fortress station in the Kepler sector, watching as massive defense platforms were moved into position around key human worlds. The construction had begun within days of Morrison's pardon, using designs that had apparently been in development for decades, but never implemented. "The psychological transformation is remarkable," she said to Admiral Sarah Martinez, the newly appointed commander of humanity's independent defense forces. "We're seeing the entire species shift from cooperative galactic citizens to suspicious isolationists in less than a year." Admiral Martinez nodded grimly. She was one of the officers who had been secretly briefed on Morrison's mission before he began his campaign against the Velkai. The human military leadership had known what was coming and had been preparing for the aftermath. "It's not isolationism," she corrected. "It's strategic independence. We're still participating in galactic civilization, but we're doing it from a position of strength rather than vulnerability." Morrison's actions gave us the political cover to implement defensive measures that would have been considered aggressive or hostile under the old paradigm. Through the observation ports, they could see human shipyards working around the clock to construct vessels that incorporated lessons learned from Morrison's campaign. The new ships were faster, more heavily armed, and equipped with stealth technology that made them nearly invisible to conventional detection systems. Most importantly, they were designed to operate independently for extended periods without support from galactic infrastructure. "The other species are noticing," Dr. Vasquez observed. "Intelligence reports suggest that at least 12 different civilizations are implementing similar defensive programs. Everyone's preparing for the next crisis, and no one trusts the Council to handle it effectively." Admiral Martinez pulled up a holographic display showing ship movements throughout the galaxy. Red icons indicated military buildups, yellow showed enhanced security patrols, and blue marked new defensive installations. The display was dominated by red and yellow, with very little green indicating normal peaceful activity. "The Galactic Council has lost its monopoly on legitimate force," she said. "For the first time in millennia, individual species are building military capabilities that rival or exceed Council peacekeeping forces. That fundamentally changes the balance of power in every political relationship." On Nexus Prime, Archon Zulthara was experiencing something it had not felt in over 10,000 years: genuine uncertainty about the future. The ancient being had presided over the rise and fall of countless civilizations, but it had never seen anything like the cascade of changes that were now sweeping through galactic society. Emergency council sessions were being called on a weekly basis as new crises emerged. The Shardaki Collective had discovered evidence of Zephyrian infiltration dating back centuries, leading to the complete severance of diplomatic relations and the establishment of militarized buffer zones between their territories. The ethereal communion had withdrawn from direct physical interaction with other species, claiming that their collective consciousness had detected systematic deception patterns that required defensive isolation protocols. Most disturbing of all, 3 minor species had simply vanished from galactic civilization entirely. Their worlds were empty, their colonies abandoned, and their starships gone without any explanation or trace of where they might have relocated. Intelligence agencies across the galaxy were desperately trying to determine whether these species had been victims of hidden genocides or had simply decided to disappear rather than risk exposure to threats they couldn't identify. The Archon materialized in its private chamber, a space that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously and could only be accessed by beings with its level of consciousness. Here it could think without the constant pressure of political considerations and species-specific psychological limitations. The Morrison case had revealed fundamental flaws in the galactic order that the Archon had helped to establish. The system was designed for civilizations that operated with relative transparency and good faith. It could not cope with threats that used advanced technology and careful planning to hide atrocities on a massive scale. But the cure was proving to be as destructive as the disease. The galaxy was fragmenting into suspicious, heavily armed camps, each species preparing for conflicts that might never come while abandoning the cooperative frameworks that had enabled unprecedented prosperity and scientific advancement. A communication request interrupted the Archon's contemplation. The signal was coming from an unexpected source, John Morrison himself, calling from somewhere in human space. The Archon accepted the connection, and Morrison's image appeared in the chamber's central display area. He looked exactly the same as he had during his trial, with the same calm expression and steady eyes that had unsettled so many beings in the council chamber. "Honored Archon," Morrison said with a slight nod that might have been respectful or might have been mocking. "I trust you've been observing recent developments with interest." "Human Morrison," the Archon replied, its voice carefully neutral. "You have certainly achieved your apparent objective. Galactic civilization is transforming exactly as your actions suggested it would." Morrison smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "My objective was to eliminate the specific threat that the Velkai posed to humanity. Everything else has been an unintended but predictable consequence of the moral and political contradictions inherent in your system." The Archon's form shifted slightly, indicating increased attention or possibly concern. "You speak as though you anticipated these broader consequences." "Of course I did," Morrison replied matter-of-factly. "Any system that relies on trust and cooperation between different species will inevitably be exploited by those willing to abuse that trust. The Velkai were just the first to be exposed. There are others, and they're all scrambling to cover their tracks or eliminate potential threats before they can be discovered." The implications of this statement were staggering. Morrison was suggesting that the current chaos was not an overreaction to a single incident, but rather a rational response to systematic problems that had always existed but had been hidden until now. "What do you propose should be done about this situation?" the Archon asked, though it suspected it would not like the answer. "Nothing," Morrison replied immediately. This transformation was inevitable once the truth about hidden atrocities became known. The old system of naive cooperation was built on willful ignorance and institutional blindness. What's emerging now is more honest, even if it's also more dangerous. He paused, and his expression grew more serious. The galaxy is learning to operate based on verified trust rather than assumed goodwill. Species are developing the capabilities to protect themselves rather than relying on external authorities that have proven inadequate. In the long term, this will create a more stable and sustainable civilization. Even if it results in widespread conflict in the short term, the Archon pressed. Especially because it will result in conflict, Morrison answered. Hidden conflicts are always more destructive than open ones. What we're seeing now is the end of secret wars and the beginning of honest preparation for honest confrontations. When species know that their neighbors are watching and are prepared to respond to threats, they're less likely to engage in the kinds of activities that created this crisis in the first place. The logic was cold but undeniable. Morrison was describing a galactic balance of power based on mutual deterrence rather than institutional authority. It was a system that would be more stable in the long run, but would require a period of chaos and conflict to establish the new equilibrium. You have effectively ended the age of galactic civilization as we have known it, the Archon said. Yes, Morrison agreed without any apparent regret. And I've begun the age of galactic civilization as it needs to be. The connection ended, leaving the Archon alone with its thoughts and the growing realization that the galaxy would never return to the way it had been before Morrison's trial. The transformation was too fundamental and too widespread to reverse. Meanwhile, on Earth, Morrison was standing in the garden of a small house in rural Canada, watching his grandchildren play while their parents worried about the galactic situation on the news feeds. He had chosen to retire to the most peaceful place he could find after completing what he considered to be his life's work. But retirement was not the escape he had hoped it would be. Reports continued to reach him about the consequences of his actions, and each new development confirmed his predictions about the transformation of galactic civilization. The latest intelligence briefings painted a picture of unprecedented military buildup across dozens of species. The Crothri had formed a defensive alliance with humanity and 3 other species, creating a power block that rivaled the traditional council authorities. The Ethereal Communion had announced the development of new defensive technologies that could disable entire fleets without causing permanent damage to their crews. Even the peaceful Shardaki were constructing mobile fortress worlds that could relocate their entire civilization if threatened. Most significantly, a new form of interspecies diplomacy was emerging. Instead of the formal protocols and institutional frameworks that had governed galactic politics for millennia, species were now engaging in direct negotiations based on openly acknowledged military capabilities and clearly stated red lines. The Thelian-Axiom conflict had been resolved not through council mediation, but through direct negotiation between military commanders who understood exactly what each side was capable of and what they were willing to do. The resulting agreement was more durable than any treaty the Council had ever brokered because both sides knew the consequences of violation would be immediate and devastating. Morrison's granddaughter ran up to him with a drawing she had made of spaceships and alien worlds, chattering excitedly about her dreams of exploring the galaxy when she grew up. He smiled and praised her artwork, but privately he wondered what kind of galaxy she would inherit. The transformation was still ongoing, and its ultimate outcome remained uncertain. Some species were adapting well to the new reality, developing sophisticated defensive capabilities while maintaining productive relationships with their neighbors. Others were struggling with the increased military spending and political tensions that the new order required. But there was no going back. The revelation of Velkai atrocities had shattered the illusion that galactic civilization was fundamentally peaceful and cooperative. Now that species knew their neighbors were capable of systematic deception and hidden violence, the old systems based on trust and institutional oversight were no longer viable. 3 years after Morrison's trial, the galaxy had stabilized into a new configuration that would have been unrecognizable to previous generations. The Galactic Council still existed, but its role had fundamentally changed from active governance to neutral arbitration between independent power blocks. Species maintained embassies and trade relationships, but they also maintained intelligence networks and defensive capabilities that would have been considered unthinkably aggressive under the old system. The change was most visible in the younger generation of beings across all species. They had grown up expecting verification rather than trust, preparation rather than hope, and strength rather than protection from external authorities. They were more suspicious than their predecessors, but they were also more capable of protecting themselves and their civilizations from hidden threats. And somewhere in the vast galaxy, other species were undoubtedly planning the same kinds of hidden atrocities that the Velkai had perpetrated. But now they faced a universe where such activities would be detected quickly and punished immediately by species that had learned to watch their neighbors carefully and strike without hesitation when threatened. John Morrison had set out to avenge his people and eliminate a specific threat to humanity. In doing so, he had accidentally created a galactic civilization that was more honest, more dangerous, and ultimately more stable than anything that had existed before. The stars themselves might not have shattered, but the naive hope that had held galactic civilization together for millennia was gone forever, replaced by something harder but more durable. The cold knowledge that survival required strength, vigilance, and the willingness to act decisively when faced with existential threats. The galaxy had learned humanity's most important lesson. That peace could only be preserved through the credible threat of overwhelming violence, and that the price of survival was eternal vigilance against those who would hide their evil intentions behind facades of cooperation and goodwill. Morrison's legacy was not the destruction of galactic civilization, but its transformation into something that could actually survive in a universe where advanced species were capable of unimaginable cruelties disguised as scientific curiosity. The aftermath had indeed shattered the stars, breaking apart old alliances and assumptions, but from the fragments was emerging something stronger and more honest than what had come before. The age of naive cooperation was over. The age of verified trust had begun.